The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, sliding across the polished mahogany desk of Victoria Ashford's 42nd floor office with the quiet whisper of expensive paper against wood. Her assistant, Marcus, had placed it there among the usual stack of contracts, quarterly reports, and acquisition proposals. But something about this particular piece of mail made Victoria's fingers pause mid-reach for her morning espresso. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind that spoke of someone who had learned to write before computers became commonplace, someone who still believed that words carried more weight when shaped by hand. Her name, Ms. Victoria Ashford, was written in faded blue ink, and beneath it, an address she hadn't called home in over 3 decades, the modest brownstone in Brooklyn, where she'd lived as a young woman, fresh out of business school, dreaming of empires she'd one day build. Victoria's throat tightened as she recognized the return address, Mel's Diner, an establishment she remembered from her early days in the city, though she couldn't quite place why the name stirred something deep in her chest. The paper felt substantial between her fingers, not the cheap stationery she might have expected from a restaurant, but something chosen with care, something that suggested the sender understood the weight of what they were about to communicate. She opened the envelope with the silver letter opener that had belonged to her late husband, Richard, a man whose memory still haunted the edges of every decision she made, every empire she built, every wall she constructed around her heart. Inside, wrapped carefully in tissue paper that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme, was something that made her breath catch in her throat so violently that she had to grip the edge of her desk to steady herself. A wedding ring. Her wedding ring. The simple gold band that had disappeared 30 years ago during the worst week of her life, when the world had crumbled around her and she'd thought she'd lost everything that mattered. The ring Richard had placed on her finger in a small ceremony in Central Park, surrounded by friends who couldn't afford expensive gifts but had given them something far more valuable: their presence, their laughter, their belief that love could conquer the practical realities of 2 kids from different worlds trying to build something lasting. The metal had aged beautifully, developing the kind of patina that only came from years of wear, though she knew it had been lost long before it could have achieved that particular warmth. Someone had cared for it, polished it, kept it safe all these years. Her vision blurred as she held it up to the morning light streaming through her floor-to-ceiling windows, windows that offered a view of Manhattan that most people could only dream of, but which suddenly felt as cold and distant as the surface of the moon. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the letter that had been tucked beneath the ring. The same careful handwriting filled 2 pages, and as she began to read, the bustling sounds of her corporate empire, the distant hum of elevators, the muffled voices of meetings and conference rooms, the gentle chime of phones and computers faded into something that felt like the edge of memory itself. "Dear Ms. Ashford," the letter began, and Victoria could almost hear the voice behind the words, though she couldn't yet place it. "Elena Martinez, I've been holding on to something that belongs to you for longer than either of us probably expected." Elena Martinez, the name rolled around in Victoria's mind like a marble in an empty room, familiar but not quite recognizable, like a song she'd heard in another lifetime. She continued reading, her heart rate accelerating with each carefully chosen word. 30 years ago, you came into the diner where I worked, Mel's, on the corner of 5th and Prospect in Brooklyn. You might not remember me, but I remember you. Not because you were rude or difficult, like some of the customers we got, but because you looked like someone carrying the weight of the entire world on your shoulders. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, and you ordered coffee and pie, though you barely touched either. Victoria remembered that version of herself with a mixture of compassion and pain. The young woman who'd spent weeks dividing her time between Richard's bedside and the small startup company they'd been building together, trying to keep their dreams alive while watching the love of her life slip away one monitored heartbeat at a time. She'd been living on coffee and determination, sleeping in hospital chairs, wearing the same clothes for days until friends forced her to go home and shower. "I called after you," the letter went on, "but the street was busy and you didn't hear me. I thought about running after you, but you looked like someone who needed to be alone with whatever you were carrying. So I kept the ring, thinking you'd come back for it. I waited every shift for weeks, always watching the door, always hoping to see you walk through it again." But Victoria never returned. Richard had died 2 weeks later, on a Thursday morning when the autumn light streaming through his hospital window had seemed too beautiful for such an ending. She'd left Brooklyn after that, unable to bear the weight of memories that lived in every street corner, every coffee shop, every place where she and Richard had dreamed of the future they'd build together. She'd taken their business plans and her broken heart to Silicon Valley, where she'd thrown herself into work with the kind of desperate intensity that either destroys you or transforms you into something harder than you ever imagined you could become. As the weeks turned into months and the months turned into years, Elena continued, "I kept the ring in a small box behind the counter. Other waitresses came and went, but I stayed, and I always made sure they knew about the ring, just in case you ever came back." Mel passed away 12 years ago and left the diner to his nephew, who sold it to a chain restaurant, but I kept the ring. I've carried it with me through 3 different jobs, 2 moves, and 1 divorce, always thinking that someday I find a way to get it back to you. Victoria's eyes were streaming now, and she didn't bother to wipe away the tears. Through her office windows, she could see the city spread out below her like a circuit board of lights and possibilities. The same city where she'd once been young and broke and desperately in love, where she'd learned that the most profound losses could become the foundations for the most unexpected strength. "I know you're successful now," Elena's letter continued. "I've seen you in magazines, on the news, in articles about women who've changed the world of business. I'm proud of you, even though we're strangers. But I also know that success doesn't always fill the spaces that loss carves out of us. I'm returning this ring not because I think it will bring back what you've lost, but because I believe some things are too precious to remain lost forever, even when the people we love them with are gone." The letter was signed simply, "With hope and respect, Elena Martinez," followed by a phone number and an address in Queens. Below that, in smaller handwriting, she had added, "P.S. I still work nights, if you'd ever like to talk. The coffee's better at the new place, but the kindness is the same." Victoria sat in her executive chair, surrounded by the trappings of the empire she'd built from the ashes of her grief, holding a simple gold ring that connected her to a version of herself she thought was buried forever. Outside her windows, the city hummed with the dreams and struggles of millions of people, including, somewhere in Queens, a woman named Elena Martinez who had spent 30 years safeguarding a stranger's most precious memory. For the first time in decades, Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashford Industries, billionaire philanthropist, and one of the most powerful women in corporate America, had absolutely no idea what to do next. But as she slipped the ring onto the finger where it had once lived, feeling it settle into place with the comfortable familiarity of coming home, she realized that for the first time in 30 years, she wasn't sure she wanted to know what came next. Sometimes, she thought, the most profound moments were the ones that left you without a plan, without a strategy, with nothing but the weight of human kindness and the possibility that some things, love, memory, connection, could survive even the longest winters of the heart. The morning sun climbed higher beyond her windows, and Victoria Ashford, who had spent 30 years building walls around her heart, began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was time to start opening doors instead. Victoria's hands shook as she stared at the ring. Her phone buzzed urgently. The board meeting about the Peterson merger was starting in 20 minutes. $40 million hung in the balance. But for the first time in 15 years, Victoria Ashford walked out of her office without explanation, leaving her entire empire waiting. Her assistant Marcus raised an eyebrow but knew better than to question decisions that came with that particular tone in her voice, the one that suggested she was operating from a place deeper than business strategy, somewhere in the realm of the personal that she rarely allowed to intersect with her professional life. She drove herself home to the penthouse overlooking Central Park, another thing she rarely did. Usually, her driver navigated the chaos of Manhattan traffic while she worked from the back seat, transforming travel time into productivity, every minute accounted for and optimized. But today, she needed the simple act of controlling something, of making the small decisions that driving required, of existing in the liminal space between one place and another where thoughts could unfold without the pressure of immediate action. The penthouse felt different when she entered it in the middle of the day. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows in ways she rarely saw, creating patterns on the Italian marble floors that seemed foreign and beautiful, like discovering a secret room in a house you'd lived in for years. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, looked surprised to see her, but simply nodded and retreated to the kitchen, understanding through decades of service that Victoria occasionally needed space to wrestle with thoughts that couldn't be scheduled or delegated. Victoria poured herself a glass of wine, a 1985 Bordeaux that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and sat in her living room, staring at the ring she'd placed on the coffee table. It seemed impossibly small against the vastness of her current life, like a single star visible through the light pollution of the city, easy to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. Her assistant, Marcus, knocked sharply. "Victoria, the board is furious. Peterson's threatening to walk. You need to get back there now." "Tell them the deal's off," Victoria said without turning around. "What? Victoria, this merger represents—" "I said the deal's off." She held up the ring. "Some things matter more than money, Marcus. I'm just remembering what those things are." She remembered the diner, vaguely. Red vinyl booths, the smell of coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. The kind of place that existed in the margins of the city, serving people who worked odd hours or couldn't sleep, or were, like she had been, running from thoughts too large for the spaces they were meant to inhabit. But Elena herself remained elusive, a presence more than a person in her memory. Victoria tried to imagine what kind of woman holds on to a stranger's wedding ring for 30 years. What kind of heart maintains that level of hope through years of silence? It spoke to a faith in human connection that Victoria had systematically trained herself to view as naive, impractical, a luxury that successful people couldn't afford. She walked to her study, where the walls were lined with awards and photographs documenting her rise through the business world. Board appointments, groundbreaking ceremonies, handshakes with politicians and celebrities and other titans of industry. But as she looked at them now, she realized that in none of these photographs did she look truly happy. Accomplished, yes. Confident, certainly. But happy? That was something else entirely. Something that seemed to have been edited out of her life so gradually that she hadn't noticed its absence until this moment. In the bottom drawer of her desk, behind files of important documents and legal papers, she kept a small box she rarely opened. Inside were the remnants of her life with Richard. Photographs, letters, the program from their tiny wedding, ticket stubs from movies they'd seen together, a dried rose from their first Valentine's Day when they'd been too poor for expensive gifts, but rich in the kind of love that made every gesture feel precious. She pulled out their favorite photograph, taken by a friend at a party in their cramped Brooklyn apartment, both of them laughing at something she could no longer remember. Richard's arm around her waist, her head thrown back in genuine delight. They looked impossibly young, impossibly optimistic, like people who believed the world would bend toward their dreams if they just worked hard enough and loved each other fiercely enough. That version of herself felt like a stranger now, someone she'd once known intimately but had gradually grown apart from. The way childhood friends drift away, not through any conscious decision, but through the simple accumulation of different choices, different priorities, different definitions of what mattered. The woman in the photograph had been building a life around love. The woman she had become built an empire around its absence. Victoria's phone buzzed with messages from her office, decisions that needed to be made, contracts that required her signature, crises that apparently couldn't wait for her attention. She ignored them all, something that would have been unthinkable yesterday, but felt absolutely necessary today. Instead, she found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She called in sick. "I need you to clear my schedule for the rest of the week," she told Marcus, who had been her assistant for 8 years and had never heard her take more than a long weekend. "Are you all right?" he asked, and she could hear the genuine concern in his voice, the affection that had developed between them despite her best efforts to maintain professional distance. "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "I just need some time to think." After she hung up, she sat in her study, surrounded by the evidence of her success, and found herself wondering what Richard would think of the woman she'd become. He'd been proud of her ambition, had encouraged her to dream bigger than either of their backgrounds suggested was practical. But he'd also been the one who insisted they take walks in Prospect Park just to watch the seasons change, who brought her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, not because she needed it, but because small gestures of care were their own form of wealth. She remembered the night they'd designed their first business plan, sitting cross-legged on their living room floor with legal pads and calculators and dreams that felt as solid as mathematical equations. They were going to change the world, or at least their small corner of it, by creating technology that would help small businesses compete with larger corporations. It was idealistic and probably naive, but it was theirs, built from their shared conviction that success should lift others up rather than simply elevating themselves. The company she'd eventually built bore no resemblance to those early dreams. Ashford Industries was efficient, profitable, and ruthlessly competitive, but it served shareholders more than communities, prioritized growth over the kind of incremental change that actually improved people's lives. She'd told herself that this was simply how business worked in the real world, that their youthful idealism had been a luxury she couldn't afford once she was building something alone. But sitting in her study, turning Elena's letter over in her hands, she wondered if what she'd really lost wasn't naivety, but something far more valuable. The ability to see business as an extension of human relationships rather than a replacement for them. Richard had understood that money was just a tool, that the real measure of success was whether you'd use that tool to create something beautiful, something that honored the people who trusted you with their dreams and investments and livelihoods. The ring caught the afternoon light from her window, and Victoria slipped it onto her finger again, feeling its weight settle against her skin like a question she'd been avoiding for 30 years. Who might she have become if Richard had lived? What kind of company might they have built together? What kind of woman would she be now if she'd learned to grow around her grief rather than building walls to contain it? She thought about Elena Martinez, working night shifts and carrying a stranger's wedding ring through decades of her own life changes, her own losses and victories and ordinary Tuesdays that accumulated into the shape of a life lived with intention. There was something profoundly generous about that kind of caretaking, something that suggested Elena understood that some things were worth preserving, even when, especially when, you couldn't see the immediate value in holding on to them. She walked to her kitchen and made herself a simple dinner, something she rarely did in a life typically catered by restaurants and private chefs. As she chopped vegetables and waited for pasta to boil, she found herself thinking about Elena's postscript. "I still work nights, if you'd ever like to talk. The coffee's better at the new place, but the kindness is the same." It was an invitation that assumed nothing, demanded nothing, but offered something Victoria hadn't realized she was hungry for: the possibility of connection without agenda, conversation without transaction, the simple human exchange of story and listening that she had somehow edited out of her life in pursuit of efficiency and control. The sun set behind the Manhattan skyline, painting her penthouse in shades of gold and amber that reminded her of the light in Richard's hospital room during those final weeks, when time had felt both precious and cruel. every moment weighted with the knowledge that moments were finite, that love, no matter how deep, couldn't negotiate with mortality. But as she stood in her kitchen, wearing a ring that had traveled 30 years to find its way back to her hand, Victoria began to wonder if maybe love didn't end with death, but simply changed form, becoming the kindness of strangers, the persistence of memory, the willingness of people like Elena Martinez to believe that some things were worth saving, even when, especially when, you couldn't see the immediate value in holding on to them. For the first time in decades, Victoria Ashford found herself curious about tomorrow in a way that had nothing to do with quarterly projections or market analysis or the carefully orchestrated expansion of her empire. She was curious about a woman in Queens who worked night shifts and carried a stranger's wedding ring through decades of her own life changes, her own losses and victories and ordinary Tuesdays that accumulated into the shape of a life lived with intention. The pasta was ready, steam rising from the pot like incense, like prayers, like the breath of possibility itself. The next morning, Victoria did something she hadn't done in 20 years. She took the subway. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to remember what it felt like to move through the city at the same pace as everyone else, to be surrounded by the ambient hum of other people's lives, their conversations and concerns and small daily victories that formed the texture of a community she had gradually insulated herself from.
The Q train to Queens felt like traveling backward through time, each stop taking her further from the gleaming towers of Manhattan and deeper into the kind of neighborhoods where people worked multiple jobs and worried about rent and still found ways to be kind to strangers. She watched through the window as luxury condos gave way to modest apartment buildings, as Starbucks gave way to family-owned bodegas, as the city revealed its layers like an archaeological dig through decades of dreams and determination. Elena's address led her to a modest apartment building in Astoria, the kind of place where laundry hung from fire escapes and children played on sidewalks that had seen generations of hopeful immigrants arrive with nothing but ambition and the belief that America rewarded hard work with opportunity. Victoria stood outside for several minutes, struck by how foreign this world felt. Despite being only a subway ride from her penthouse, how completely she'd separated herself from the kind of life she'd once lived. The woman who answered the door was small and sturdy, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience without bitterness. Elena Martinez looked exactly like someone who would spend 30 years keeping a stranger's wedding ring safe, Victoria thought. Someone whose face suggested she understood that small acts of caretaking were their own form of resistance against a world that often seemed designed to encourage indifference. "Ms. Ashford?" Elena said, and her voice carried the same careful warmth that had been evident in her letter. "I wondered if you might come. Please, come in." The apartment was small but immaculate, filled with the kind of furniture that was chosen for comfort rather than style, for durability rather than fashion. Family photographs covered one wall. Children and grandchildren, Victoria assumed. Faces bright with the particular joy of people who had been raised to believe that happiness was something you created rather than something you purchased. "I should thank you," Victoria began, but Elena raised her hand gently, the gesture of someone accustomed to putting others at ease. "Let me make coffee first. Real coffee, not the stuff they serve at most places. Then we can talk." Victoria watched as Elena moved around her small kitchen with the economy of motion that came from years of waitressing, each gesture efficient but unhurried. There was something deeply peaceful about being in a space where someone else was taking care of the details, where she could simply sit and exist without having to orchestrate or optimize or control the flow of events around her. "I have to ask," Victoria said, when Elena returned with 2 cups of coffee that smelled like comfort itself, "why did you keep it? 30 years is a long time to hold on to something that belonged to a stranger." Elena studied Victoria's face carefully. "You want to know why I kept it? Because that night, you looked at me, really looked at me, like I was a human being. not just someone to bring you coffee. Do you know how rare that is for people like me? Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. People like you, she said. People who serve people like you, Elena said quietly. That's the thing, though. After that night, you weren't really a stranger anymore. You were someone who'd trusted me with something precious, even if you didn't know it at the time. But you could have sold it or thrown it away, or my grandmother taught me something. Elena interrupted gently. She used to say that we're all connected by invisible threads, and that sometimes we're called to be caretakers for parts of other people's stories, even when we don't understand the whole picture. That ring wasn't just jewelry, it was somebody's love made visible, somebody's promise turned into something you could hold. How do you throw away someone's promise? Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of muscles she didn't realize she'd been holding tight. Tell me about that night. I remember pieces, but it's all wrapped up in... She paused, searching for words that could contain the magnitude of what she'd been feeling then. In grief, Elena finished quietly. You looked like someone whose whole world had just changed, like you were trying to figure out how to keep breathing when the air itself felt different. My husband was dying, Victoria said, and the words came more easily than she'd expected. Brain trauma from a car accident. We'd been married 2 years, and we had all these plans, all these dreams we were building together. That night, I'd just come from the hospital where the doctors had finally said what I think I'd known for weeks but couldn't admit, that he wasn't going to recover. Elena nodded, her face soft with the kind of understanding that could only come from someone who'd carried their own share of loss. I lost my first husband when I was 35. Cancer. It's different, but the same, you know? The way the future you'd been planning just disappears, and suddenly you're standing in a place you never thought you'd have to navigate alone. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking coffee and sharing the particular intimacy of people who'd both learned that love and loss were often inseparable, that the depth of one made the other inevitable. What happened after? I mean, I know you became successful, but what happened to the woman who sat in that diner?
Victoria considered the question, trying to trace the path from that broken young woman to the billionaire CEO she'd become. I ran away, she said finally. Left Brooklyn, left New York, left everything that reminded me of the life we'd been building together. I threw myself into work, into building the company we dreamed about. But I built it alone. I built everything alone. And now? Now I'm sitting in Queens talking to someone who kept my wedding ring safe for 30 years. And I'm trying to remember what it felt like to believe that connection was possible, that people could care about each other without wanting something in return. Victoria paused, looking around Elena's modest apartment. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, but I can't remember the last time someone did something kind for me without expecting something back. Elena leaned forward slightly, her expression serious but not unkind. Can I ask you something that might sound harsh? Victoria nodded. When was the last time you did something kind for someone without expecting something back? The question hit like a physical blow, not because it was unfair, but because it was absolutely fair. Victoria tried to think of examples, her charitable donations, her scholarship programs, her foundation's work, but she realized that all of those things, while beneficial, were also strategic, tax advantageous, carefully calibrated to enhance her reputation while helping others. When had she last acted from pure generosity, from the simple human impulse to make someone else's day a little brighter? I don't know, she admitted. Somewhere along the way, I think I forgot how to give without calculating the return on investment. That's not unusual, Elena said gently.
When you're building something big, it's easy to start thinking of everything in terms of strategy and efficiency. But people aren't problems to be solved or resources to be optimized. They're just people trying to figure out how to be human in a world that doesn't always make that easy. Victoria thought about her employees, the thousands of people who worked for Ashford Industries, whose livelihoods depended on her decisions, but whose names she rarely knew, whose stories she'd never heard. She thought about Marcus, her assistant, who'd been with her for 8 years, but whose life outside the office remained a mystery to her because she'd never bothered to ask. She thought about Miss Chen, her housekeeper, who left small, thoughtful touches throughout her penthouse. Fresh flowers, favorite foods, books placed precisely where Victoria might want them, and how she'd never acknowledged these gestures as anything more than services she was paying for. "I think I built walls," Victoria said slowly, "to protect myself from ever feeling that kind of loss again. But the walls kept out everything else too. I became successful, but I also became isolated." "Walls are useful," Elena said. "They protect us when we need protection. But if you never open the doors, you forget there's a world outside worth entering." Elena stood and moved to a small bookshelf in the corner of her living room, returning with a photo album that looked well-loved, its pages thick with memories and handling. "Can I show you something?" She opened the album to a page filled with photographs of people Victoria didn't recognize. Customers at the diner, she realized. Faces captured in moments of laughter and conversation and simple human connection. "I started taking these after you left that night," Elena explained. "I began to notice all the stories that came through that diner. People meeting for first dates, families celebrating birthdays with pie instead of cake because that's what they could afford, truck drivers stopping for coffee and conversation on long hauls across the country. I realized that everyone who walked through those doors was carrying something: hope, sadness, dreams, disappointments, and that sometimes the most important thing I could do was simply witness their stories, make sure they felt seen." She turned the pages, showing Victoria dozens of faces, each one accompanied by a small note describing who they were, what they'd been going through, and how Elena had tried to make their experience a little brighter. A teenage mother studying for her GED while her baby slept in a carrier beside her booth. An elderly man who came in every Tuesday for the anniversary of his wife's death, not because he was hungry, but because he couldn't bear to spend that day alone. 2 women who had been coming to the diner for first-time meetings after connecting through a support group for widows. "This is what I learned from keeping your ring. That we're all connected. That our stories matter to each other, even when we're strangers. That small acts of caring can ripple out in ways we never expect. You weren't just someone who lost a ring that night. You were someone whose love was worth preserving, even when you couldn't see it yourself." Victoria felt tears running down her face, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly when they'd started. She was crying for the young woman who'd sat in that diner 30 years ago, for the husband she'd loved and lost, for the decades she'd spent building walls instead of bridges, for all the connections she'd missed because she'd been so focused on protecting herself from further loss that she'd forgotten the risk was also the point. "I don't know how to go back," she said. "I don't know how to be the person who could sit in that diner and accept kindness from a stranger." Elena reached across the small space between their chairs and took Victoria's hand, a gesture so simple and natural that it took Victoria a moment to realize how long it had been since someone had touched her with simple human affection rather than the calculated contact of business handshakes and professional networking. "You don't go back," Elena said gently. "You start from where you are. The woman who sat in that diner 30 years ago needed protection and walls and time to heal. The woman sitting here today has the resources to open doors, to connect, to use everything she's built in service of something larger than just success." Victoria looked around Elena's modest apartment, at the photographs of strangers who'd become part of Elena's extended family through shared moments and witnessed stories,
at the evidence of a life lived with intentional kindness and purposeful connection. This woman, who had so much less than Victoria in terms of money and power and material success, was infinitely richer in the currencies that actually mattered: community, compassion, the deep satisfaction that came from knowing your presence in the world made other people's lives a little brighter. What would that look like? Victoria asked, opening doors instead of building walls. Elena smiled, and her whole face transformed with the kind of joy that came from seeing someone take their first steps toward a different kind of life. "I have some ideas," she said, "but first, I want to show you something else." She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a small wooden box worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were dozens of small objects: a child's drawing, a subway token, a pressed flower, a folded napkin with a phone number written in careful handwriting. These are things people left behind. Not expensive things, not important things by most standards, but things that mattered to someone. I keep them the same way I kept your ring, just in case someone comes looking for the piece of their story they thought was lost forever. Victoria understood then that Elena hadn't just been keeping her ring safe for 30 years. She'd been running a museum of human connection, a repository of moments and memories and small treasures that spoke to people's capacity for caring about each other across time and circumstance and the ordinary distances that separated strangers who might, under different conditions, have been friends. "This is what you do," Victoria said, and it wasn't a question. "This is who you are." "This is who we all are," Elena corrected gently. "When we remember that taking care of each other isn't an inconvenience or a distraction from our real lives, it is our real lives." The afternoon sun streamed through Elena's living room window, illuminating the photographs and mementos and evidence of a life lived in service to the simple, radical proposition that everyone's story mattered, that small acts of kindness could accumulate into something that looked a lot like love, that the most important things we could do were often the things that couldn't be measured or optimized or turned into quarterly reports. Victoria sat in that light, wearing her wedding ring for the first time in 30 years, surrounded by proof that the world contained people who spent their lives being caretakers for other people's hopes and memories and moments of grace, and she began to understand that maybe wealth wasn't about what you accumulated, but about what you gave away. That power wasn't about what you could control, but about what you could nurture. That success wasn't about building something that would outlast you, but about connecting with people in ways that made both of your lives more beautiful. That conversation became the beginning of what Victoria would later think of as her real education. At first, she told herself she was conducting research, trying to understand what made someone like Elena tick, what drove a person to spend decades caring for strangers' lost treasures. But gradually, she began to recognize that what she was really doing was remembering how to be human in the presence of another person without agenda, without strategy, without the carefully constructed barriers she'd spent 30 years perfecting. Elena's schedule was complex, a testament to the reality that kindness didn't pay the rent. She worked overnight shifts at a 24-hour diner in Long Island City, filled in at a bakery on weekends, and cleaned offices in Midtown twice a week. But she always seemed to have time for conversation, for coffee, for the kinds of meandering discussions that Victoria had forgotten were possible between adults who weren't trying to close deals or negotiate contracts or establish dominance in corporate hierarchies. "Tell me about the others," Victoria said one afternoon, gesturing toward the wooden box of found treasures that had become a focal point of Elena's living room. "The people who left these things behind." Elena's eyes lit up with the particular joy of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this question. She pulled out a small ceramic elephant, worn smooth by handling. This belonged to Maria Santos, a woman who used to come in every Thursday night around midnight. She worked 3 jobs: house cleaning during the day, bookkeeping for a small law firm in the evenings, and dishwashing at the diner where I worked. She carried this elephant in her purse, said it was a gift from her daughter back in Guatemala. What happened to her? She saved enough money to bring her daughter to New York, finally got her papers sorted out. The night before Maria left for the airport to pick her up, she was so nervous and excited that she forgot her purse when she left the diner. By the time I realized it, she was gone. I tried to find her, but she'd moved out of her apartment, probably to somewhere bigger now that her daughter was coming. I still have her elephant, still hope that someday she'll walk into whatever restaurant I'm working at and I can give it back to her." Victoria held the small ceramic figure, feeling its weight, negligible in monetary terms, immeasurable in emotional value. "Have you tried to find her? I mean, really find her, with resources?" Elena looked puzzled. What kind of resources? For the first time in weeks, Victoria felt the familiar stirring of strategic thinking, but instead of being directed toward market dominance or competitive advantage, it was focused on something infinitely more satisfying, the possibility of reuniting people with pieces of their stories they thought were lost forever. "Private investigators," Victoria said, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Database searches, immigration records, employment verification services. Elena, I could find Maria Santos in probably less than a week." Elena's face went through several expressions. Surprise, hope, something that looked like fear. "You would do that?" "I would do that," Victoria said, and meant it with a conviction that surprised her. Not as a business transaction, not as a tax write-off, not part of some corporate social responsibility initiative. Just because Maria Santos deserves to have her elephant back, and because you deserve to know that your kindness reached its intended destination. That conversation became the beginning of what Victoria would later think of as her real education. Not the MBA from Wharton, not the countless seminars on leadership and strategy, but the practical curriculum of learning how to use power and resources in service of human connection rather than personal advancement. Finding Maria Santos took 3 days and cost less than Victoria typically spent on a single business lunch. She was living in Astoria, 10 blocks from Elena's apartment, working as a supervisor at a childcare center, and taking night classes to become a certified teacher. Her daughter, now 23, was studying engineering at Queens College and working part-time at a community health clinic. The reunion took place on a Thursday evening in Elena's apartment, and Victoria found herself crying as she watched Maria recognize the ceramic elephant Elena had kept safe for 6 years. But what moved her even more was watching Elena's face as Maria explained that the elephant had been her mother's, passed down through 3 generations of women who left everything behind multiple times in search of better lives for their children. "You kept my grandmother safe," Maria told Elena, holding the small figure against her chest. "All this time, you kept her safe." Victoria began to understand that Elena's box of found treasures wasn't just a collection of lost objects. It was a repository of interrupted stories, connections severed by the practical necessities of survival in a city that didn't always make space for sentiment or the careful preservation of memory. And she began to see that her wealth and resources could be tools for completing those interrupted narratives, for proving that some things were worth preserving even when their value couldn't be quantified on any spreadsheet. The next week, they found James Morrison, the owner of a subway token from 1987 that carried with it the story of his first job interview in New York, the day he'd arrived from Ohio with $50 and a suitcase full of dreams. He was now a successful architect, but he cried when Elena returned the token, explaining that he'd carried it for luck through dozens of interviews and job applications until the day he'd finally been hired, then lost it on the subway on his way home to celebrate.
"I thought it was a sign," he told them, "that I was supposed to forget where I came from, that success meant leaving the old me behind. But I never stopped missing that token. Never stopped thinking about the kid who'd been brave enough to get on a bus to New York with nothing but hope and stubbornness." Victoria commissioned a private investigation firm to help locate the owners of every object in Elena's box, but she also began to realize that the project was teaching her something far more valuable than the satisfaction of reuniting people with their lost possessions. She was learning to see the city, her city, through Elena's eyes, as a vast network of interconnected stories, rather than a collection of resources to be optimized or markets to be captured. She started riding the subway regularly, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to remember what it felt like to move through the world at the same pace as everyone else. She began eating at diners and cafes instead of exclusive restaurants, not to slum it or to feel virtuous,
but because she'd forgotten how much more interesting conversations were when they happened between people who didn't all share the same background, the same assumptions about what mattered. One evening, as they were working through Elena's collection of photographs from the old diner, Victoria found herself looking at a picture of Elena with an elderly man she recognized from Elena's stories, the widower who came in every Tuesday on the anniversary of his wife's death. "Is he still alive?" Victoria asked. "Mr. Kowalski?" "Yes, but he's in a nursing home now. His children live on the West Coast, and he doesn't get many visitors. I try to see him when I can, but between work and everything else..." Victoria made a note in her phone, but not the kind of note she used to make about business opportunities or networking possibilities. This was different, a reminder to herself that connection was a practice, not a transaction, that the work of caring for people was ongoing and required presence, not just resources. She started visiting Mr. Kowalski every Tuesday, initially bringing Elena with her, but eventually going alone when Elena's work schedule made it impossible. He was 91, sharp as ever, and full of stories about the Brooklyn he'd known as a young man, when the neighborhoods were different, but the fundamental human needs, for community, for recognition, for the simple acknowledgement that your life had mattered, were exactly the same. "You remind me of Mayana," he told Victoria one afternoon as they sat in the nursing home's garden, watching other residents tend to tomatoes and flowers with the careful attention of people who understood that growing things was its own form of hope. She started listening differently in her business meetings, paying attention not just to what people were proposing or requesting, but to who they were as human beings, what motivated them beyond quarterly targets and performance metrics. She discovered that her CFO, Patricia, had started working in finance because she'd grown up in a family that struggled with money and wanted to help other people achieve financial security. Her head of marketing, David, had been inspired to join Ashford Industries because he believed technology could democratize access to opportunities that had traditionally been available only to people with extensive networks and resources. These weren't revelations that changed how she ran her business overnight, but they were the beginning of a different kind of relationship with the peoples whose lives intersected with hers through work. The breakthrough came during a board meeting in late October when they were discussing the annual budget for corporate philanthropy. Victoria's foundation typically donated to established charities with strong track records and tax advantages, organizations that could guarantee measurable outcomes and positive publicity for Ashford Industries. "What if we tried something different this year?" Victoria found herself saying. "What if instead of writing checks to organizations that already have plenty of funding, we focused on individual stories, people who need help with specific challenges that our resources could address directly?" The board members looked at each other with the kind of polite confusion that suggested they weren't sure whether this was a serious proposal or some kind of test of their loyalty to established procedures. "Can you be more specific?" asked Robert Chen, her longest-serving board member and someone whose business judgment she'd always respected. Victoria thought about Maria Santos, about Mr. Kowalski, about all the people Elena had served over the years who were carrying pieces of dreams that could be completed with relatively small amounts of targeted assistance. What if we created a program that helps people finish their stories? A woman who's one semester away from her nursing degree but can't afford tuition. A family that needs help with a down payment for their first house. An elderly man whose grandson wants to visit but can't afford the plane ticket from California. "That sounds like social work," said Margaret Thompson, the board member who usually advocated for the most conservative financial strategies. "What's the difference?" Victoria asked, and realized she genuinely wanted to know the answer. The question hung in the air of the conference room, surrounded by walls lined with awards and photographs documenting Ashford Industries' growth and success, and Victoria realized that this was the moment when she would either retreat back into the familiar territory of strategic giving and calculated generosity, or step forward into something that felt both more vulnerable and more authentic.
The difference, she said slowly, is that one approach treats people as problems to be solved, and the other treats them as stories worth completing. Elena Martinez kept my wedding rings safe for 30 years, not because she expected a return on investment, but because she believed my story mattered, even when I couldn't see it myself. I want our foundation to work the same way. The board approved her proposal, though Victoria suspected it was more out of deference to her success than enthusiasm for her vision. But approval was enough to begin, and beginning was all she needed to discover that using wealth to complete people's interrupted stories was infinitely more satisfying than using it to accumulate more wealth or to purchase the kind of recognition that felt hollow the moment it was achieved. Within 6 months, the Ashford Foundation's Completing Stories program had helped 43 people in New York finish projects, achieve goals, or reconnect with family members they'd lost touch with due to financial constraints rather than lack of love. Each case was different, but they all shared the common thread of being small enough to seem insignificant to most philanthropic organizations, but large enough to be life-changing for the individuals involved. Victoria found herself becoming personally involved in many of the cases, not because she needed to micromanage the program, but because she discovered that witnessing people's joy when their stories reached completion was addictive in the best possible way. She was present when Rosa Martinez, no relation to Elena, graduated from nursing school at 52, fulfilling a dream she'd postponed for 30 years while raising 5 children as a single mother. She was there when Tommy Chen received his first piano, a used upright that cost less than Victoria's typical monthly wine budget, but represented the possibility of a musical career that had seemed impossible for a kid from a family that worked 3 jobs just to pay rent. But the most profound moment came when she accompanied Elena to visit Mrs. Patterson, an 84-year-old woman who'd been coming to Elena's various workplaces for 20 years, always ordering the same thing, coffee and toast, and always leaving a $1 tip that Elena knew represented a significant percentage of Mrs. Patterson's monthly income. Mrs. Patterson had been saving money for 2 years to buy a plane ticket to Phoenix, where her great-grandson was graduating from high school. She'd raised him for 5 years after his parents died in a car accident, but when her health deteriorated, he'd moved to Arizona to live with distant relatives. She hadn't seen him in 3 years, and the cost of travel had remained just beyond her reach, despite careful saving and constant sacrifice. "I don't need much," Mrs. Patterson told them as they sat in her studio apartment, which was immaculate but sparse, furnished with pieces that had clearly been chosen for durability rather than beauty. Just enough to see Marcus walk across that stage, to let him know that someone from his original family was there to witness him becoming a man. Victoria bought the plane ticket that afternoon, but she also arranged for Mrs. Patterson to stay an extra week in Phoenix, to have dinner with Marcus every night, to attend his graduation party and meet his friends and teachers and the extended family who'd embraced him but couldn't replace the woman who taught him to read and tie his shoes and believe that education was the most reliable path toward a better life. The photographs Elena showed her after Mrs. Patterson returned were worth more than anything Victoria had ever purchased. An elderly woman and a young man hugging at an airport gate, both of them crying with the particular joy of people who'd thought they might never see each other again, surrounded by other travelers who couldn't help but smile at the obvious love radiating from their reunion. "This is what wealth is for," Victoria told Elena as they looked at the pictures together. "Not to accumulate more wealth, not to build monuments to my own success, but to complete stories that matter to people who don't have the resources to complete them themselves." Elena smiled, the expression of someone who'd been waiting years for a particular conversation partner to arrive at a conclusion she'd always known was inevitable. "Now you're beginning to understand what I learned 30 years ago," she said. "That we're all connected, that taking care of each other isn't a distraction from our real lives. It is our real lives." Victoria thought about the young woman who'd sat in that Brooklyn diner 30 decades earlier, broken and lost, and unable to imagine that grief could ever transform into something that looked like purpose. She thought about the walls she'd built around her heart, the empire she'd constructed as a fortress against further loss, the decades she'd spent accumulating power and resources without understanding that their real value lay not in what they could protect her from, but in what they could help her create for others. The ring on her finger caught the light from Elena's living room window, and Victoria realized that Elena hadn't just returned her wedding ring, she'd returned her to herself, to the woman who'd once believed that success meant lifting others up rather than simply elevating yourself. That love didn't end with death, but simply changed form, becoming the kindness of strangers, the completion of interrupted stories, the simple, radical act of using whatever resources you had in service of human connection rather than personal advancement.
5 years later, Victoria stood in the same Brooklyn neighborhood, relationships, and the fundamental question of what it meant to build something meaningful in the world. The woman who had once measured success in quarterly profits and market share began measuring it in completed stories, in connections made and preserved, in the number of people whose lives had been touched by intentional kindness rather than strategic philanthropy. The work was different from anything she'd done before or other titans of industry. She invited people from Elena's extended network, the community of servers, dishwashers, night shift workers, and immigrants whose stories had become part of Elena's careful collection over the years. Mrs. Chen, her housekeeper, was initially confused by the request to prepare dinner for 12 people who included a subway operator, a night shift security guard, a woman who cleaned office buildings, and a man who delivered newspapers at 4 in the morning. "These are your friends, Ms. Victoria?" Mrs. Chen asked, not unkindly, but with the genuine puzzlement of someone trying to understand a social dynamic that didn't fit any recognizable pattern. "They're becoming my friends," Victoria replied, and realized it was the first time in decades that she'd used the word friend to describe a relationship that wasn't primarily transactional. "Elena is teaching me that friendship isn't about what people can do for you, but about who they are when they think no one important is watching." The dinners became a monthly tradition that evolved into something Victoria had never experienced. A chosen family of people who gathered not because they shared professional interests or social status, but because they'd all been touched by Elena's particular understanding that taking care of each other was both a privilege and a responsibility. The conversations that happened around Victoria's dining table, debates about immigration policy from people who'd actually immigrated, discussions of healthcare from people who couldn't afford to get sick, and stories about education from parents who worked multiple jobs to pay for their children's books, were more illuminating than any of the corporate strategy sessions or board meetings that had previously defined her social calendar. Victoria discovered that Carlos, the security guard who worked nights at a midtown office building, was also a poet who'd published 2 books in El Salvador before coming to New York, but who hadn't written anything in 5 years because exhaustion and financial stress had crowded out the mental space that creativity required. She learned that Janet, who cleaned offices from midnight to 6 a.m., had been an art teacher in Jamaica and still carried supplies in her work bag, sketching during breaks and leaving small drawings in the offices she cleaned as anonymous gifts for the people who worked there during the day. "What would it take," Victoria asked Carlos during one of their dinners, "for you to start writing again?" Carlos laughed, but not unkindly. Time mostly, and maybe a little bit of faith that poetry matters when people are worried about paying rent and keeping their kids safe, and figuring out how to navigate systems that weren't designed for people like us. What if poetry was exactly what people needed when they're worried about those things? Victoria asked. What if beauty and meaning weren't luxuries but necessities, especially for people whose daily lives don't include much of either? The conversation led to Victoria funding a program that brought poetry workshops to community centers in Queens and Brooklyn, taught by Carlos and other immigrant writers who understood that art could be both a refuge from difficult circumstances and a tool for processing them. The workshops were free, materials were provided, and participants were encouraged to write in whatever language felt most natural to them, with translation support available for those who wanted to share their work more broadly. But the poetry program was just one piece of what Victoria began to think of as her real education in the practical applications of wealth and influence. She discovered that Janet's anonymous drawings had become legend in several midtown office buildings, with employees looking forward to finding them and creating informal networks to share photos of their favorites. Victoria commissioned Janet to create a series of murals for the lobbies of Ashford Industries buildings, paying her enough to quit her cleaning job and return to teaching art part-time while developing her own practice. The ripple effects of these individual investments began to compound in ways that Victoria's business training hadn't prepared her to anticipate. Carlos's poetry workshops led to a small publishing initiative that produced bilingual chapbooks by immigrant writers, which led to readings and cultural events that brought different communities together, which led to conversations about policy and representation that began to influence local politics in tangible ways. Victoria found herself attending city council meetings not because Ashford Industries had business before them, but because she'd become personally invested in issues that affected the people who'd become important to her. She testified in favor of affordable housing initiatives, supported small business loan programs, and advocated for policies that would make the city more hospitable to the kinds of dreams that had once brought her and Richard to New York as young people with more ambition than resources. The work was different from anything she'd done before, less immediately measurable, more dependent on relationships and trust than on market analysis and strategic planning. But it was also more satisfying than anything she'd accomplished in 30 years of corporate success, because it was grounded in the recognition that business existed to serve human flourishing rather than the other way around. They spent hours each week reviewing applications to the Completing Stories program, which had grown from Victoria's foundation into a collaborative effort that included volunteer coordinators, community liaisons, and a network of people who helped identify individuals and families whose lives could be significantly improved with relatively modest financial assistance. "Look at this one," Elena said during one of their weekly review sessions, handing Victoria an application from a woman named Diane Foster, who was 45 and had been working toward her bachelor's degree for 12 years, taking 1 or 2 classes at a time while working full-time and raising 3 children as a single mother. She was 6 credits away from graduation, but couldn't afford the tuition for her final semester. "What's her story?" Victoria asked, though she was already reaching for her checkbook. "She wants to be a social worker," Elena explained. "She grew up in foster care, aged out of the system at 18, spent her 20s struggling with housing and jobs and trying to figure out how to build a stable life without any family support. She had her first child at 28, and becoming a mother made her realize she wanted to work with kids who were going through what she'd experienced." Victoria wrote the check for Diane's tuition, but she also made a note to follow up in 6 months, not to monitor how the money was spent, but to see if there were other ways to support Diane's transition from student to professional. She'd learned that completing people's stories often required more than just addressing the immediate financial obstacle. It required understanding the broader context of their lives and finding ways to support their long-term success. 3 months later, Diane Foster graduated summa cum laude and sent Victoria a photo from the ceremony, a woman in her cap and gown, surrounded by her 3 children and beaming with the particular joy of someone who'd achieved something they'd been working toward for more than a decade. But the photo that really moved Victoria was the one Diane sent 6 months after that, her first day at work as a social worker for the city's Department of Children and Families, standing in front of an office building with the same expression of determined optimism that Victoria remembered seeing in her own mirror 30 years earlier, when she believed that hard work and good intentions could change the world. "She's going to change dozens of kids' lives," Elena said, when Victoria showed her the photos. "Kids who are going through exactly what she went through. But now they'll have an advocate who understands their experience from the inside." Victoria thought about the multiplication effect of that single tuition payment, how it would ripple out through Diane's work with children, through the families those children would eventually build, through the communities that would be shaped by people who'd been given the kind of support that helped them believe their own stories mattered enough to complete. It was this understanding of interconnection that led Victoria to make the most significant decision of her post-Elena life. She restructured Ashford Industries to become a B Corporation, legally requiring the company to consider the impact of its decisions on employees, communities, and the environment, not just shareholders. "This is going to affect our competitiveness," warned Robert Chen during one of the board meetings where they discussed the transition. "B Corp status comes with reporting requirements and decision-making constraints that our competitors won't have." "Good," Victoria replied. "If our competitiveness depends on treating people as disposable resources or treating the environment as a dumping ground for our externalized costs, then we need to become competitive in different ways." The transition to B Corp status forced Victoria to examine every aspect of Ashford Industries' operations through the lens of impact rather than just efficiency. She discovered that the company's cleaning services were contracted through a company that paid workers below living wages and provided no benefits, so she switched to a worker-owned cooperative that cost more but ensured that the people who kept their offices running could afford to live with dignity. She learned that their supply chain included manufacturers with questionable labor practices, so she invested in developing relationships with suppliers who could demonstrate genuine commitment to worker rights and environmental sustainability. Each of these changes reduced short-term profitability, but they also began to attract employees and clients who shared Victoria's evolving understanding that businesses should contribute to human flourishing rather than just extracting value from it. The company's retention rates improved, their reputation in the industry began to shift, and Victoria discovered that running a business according to principles she could actually believe in was far more energizing than optimizing for metrics that felt increasingly hollow. But the most profound change was personal. Victoria began each day not by reviewing stock prices or checking overnight emails from international markets, but by reading the updates Elena sent her about the people whose stories they were helping to complete. A photograph of Mrs. Patterson's great-grandson receiving his diploma from community college 2 years after his high school graduation. A note from Carlos about a former student whose poem had been accepted by a literary magazine. A video message from Janet's art students thanking Victoria for supporting her teacher's return to the profession she'd loved but thought she'd lost forever. These messages became the foundation of Victoria's daily motivation, the reminder that wealth was a tool whose value was determined not by how much you could accumulate, but by how much good you could do with what you'd been given. She realized that Elena had returned her to a version of herself that she thought was lost forever, the young woman who believed that success meant lifting others up rather than just elevating yourself.
The ring itself had become a daily reminder of this transformation. Victoria wore it not as a symbol of loss, but as a symbol of connection, to Richard's memory, to Elena's friendship, to the extended community of people whose lives had become intertwined with hers through the simple practice of paying attention to each other's stories and finding ways to support their completion. On the first anniversary of Elena's letter, Victoria threw a party in her penthouse. But instead of celebrating her own success or marking another year of corporate growth, she celebrated the completion of 100 stories through the Foundation's programs. The guests included program recipients, community partners, volunteers, and Elena's extended family of former customers and current friends. Mr. Kowalski, now 92, attended with his granddaughter, who'd flown in from Seattle specifically for the event. Maria Santos brought her daughter, the engineering student, who presented Victoria with a small ceramic elephant she'd made in an art class. Not a replacement for the one that had been returned to her mother, but a new one, created specifically to thank Victoria for understanding that some things were worth preserving, even when their value couldn't be measured in traditional ways. "I have something for you too," Elena told Victoria as the evening was winding down, most of the guests having said their goodbyes and headed home to lives that had been touched, in small but significant ways, by the radical proposition that everyone's story mattered enough to deserve completion. Elena handed Victoria a small wooden box, similar to the one where she'd kept found treasures for so many years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a key. "It's to the community center in Astoria," Elena explained. "The one where Carlos teaches poetry and Janet leads art classes, and Diane brings kids from the foster care system for workshops on college preparation. The city was going to close it for budget reasons, but someone made a donation that will keep it running for the next 10 years. Victoria looked at the key, understanding that it represented something far more valuable than the building it opened. It was a symbol of the infrastructure of care that they'd been building together, the network of connections and support that could sustain people through difficulties and help them complete stories they might otherwise have had to abandon. "You did this?" Victoria asked. "We did this," Elena corrected. "All of us. You with your resources, me with my connections, everyone else with their time and expertise and willingness to believe that taking care of each other is the most important work we can do." Victoria held the key in her hand, feeling its weight, negligible in physical terms, immeasurable in everything that mattered. Through her penthouse windows, the city spread out below them like a constellation of stories, each light representing someone's dreams, struggles, hopes, and efforts to build something meaningful in the brief time they'd been given. She thought about the young woman who'd sat in that Brooklyn diner 30 years earlier, broken and lost and unable to imagine that grief could ever transform into purpose. She thought about Elena, who'd spent decades being a caretaker for other people's lost treasures because she understood that small acts of kindness could accumulate into something that looked a lot like love. She thought about Richard, who believed that business should serve human flourishing, and realized that it had taken her 30 years to understand what he'd tried to teach her before they'd run out of time. The ring on her finger caught the light from the city below them, and Victoria realized that Elena hadn't just returned her wedding ring, she'd returned her to the possibility of a life lived in service to something larger than personal success, to the radical proposition that wealth was meaningless unless it was deployed in service of connection, completion, and the simple daily practice of helping other people's stories reach the endings they deserved. For the first time in 3 decades, Victoria Ashford felt truly wealthy. 5 years later, Victoria stood in the same Brooklyn neighborhood where she'd once been young and heartbroken, but now she was looking at something that would have been impossible to imagine during those dark months 30 years ago. The Richard and Victoria Ashford Community Center, a renovated warehouse that had become the headquarters for what Elena called the infrastructure of care, a network of programs, partnerships, and people committed to the simple proposition that everyone's story deserved to reach completion. The building buzzed with activity that represented the accumulation of hundreds of individual decisions to choose connection over isolation, service over accumulation, hope over fear. In the main hall, Carlos led a poetry workshop for teenagers whose parents worked multiple jobs and who'd found in verse a way to process experiences that mainstream culture rarely acknowledged.
The basement had been converted into an art studio, where Janet taught painting and sculpture to elderly residents of nearby housing projects, many of whom were creating visual art for the first time in their lives. The ring itself had become a daily reminder of this transformation. Victoria wore it not as a symbol of loss, but as a symbol of connection, to Richard's memory, to Elena's friendship, to the extended community of people whose lives had become intertwined with hers through the simple practice of paying attention to each other's stories and finding ways to support their completion. On the first anniversary of Elena's letter, Victoria threw a party in her penthouse. But instead of celebrating her own success or marking another year of corporate growth, she celebrated the completion of 100 stories through the Foundation's programs. The guests included program recipients, community partners, volunteers, and Elena's extended family of former customers and current friends. Mr. Kowalski, now 92, attended with his granddaughter, who'd flown in from Seattle specifically for the event. Maria Santos brought her daughter, the engineering student, who presented Victoria with a small ceramic elephant she'd made in an art class. Not a replacement for the one that had been returned to her mother, but a new one, created specifically to thank Victoria for understanding that some things were worth preserving, even when their value couldn't be measured in traditional ways. "I have something for you too," Elena told Victoria as the evening was winding down, most of the guests having said their goodbyes and headed home to lives that had been touched, in small but significant ways, by the radical proposition that everyone's story mattered enough to deserve completion. Elena handed Victoria a small wooden box, similar to the one where she'd kept found treasures for so many years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a key. "It's to the community center in Astoria," Elena explained. "The one where Carlos teaches poetry and Janet leads art classes, and Diane brings kids from the foster care system for workshops on college preparation. The city was going to close it for budget reasons, but someone made a donation that will keep it running for the next 10 years. Victoria looked at the key, understanding that it represented something far more valuable than the building it opened. It was a symbol of the infrastructure of care that they'd been building together, the network of connections and support that could sustain people through difficulties and help them complete stories they might otherwise have had to abandon. "You did this?" Victoria asked. "We did this," Elena corrected. "All of us. You with your resources, me with my connections, everyone else with their time and expertise and willingness to believe that taking care of each other is the most important work we can do." Victoria held the key in her hand, feeling its weight, negligible in physical terms, immeasurable in everything that mattered. Through her penthouse windows, the city spread out below them like a constellation of stories, each light representing someone's dreams, struggles, hopes, and efforts to build something meaningful in the brief time they'd been given. She thought about the young woman who'd sat in that Brooklyn diner 30 years earlier, broken and lost and unable to imagine that grief could ever transform into purpose. She thought about Elena, who'd spent decades being a caretaker for other people's lost treasures because she understood that small acts of kindness could accumulate into something that looked a lot like love. She thought about Richard, who believed that business should serve human flourishing, and realized that it had taken her 30 years to understand what he'd tried to teach her before they'd run out of time. The ring on her finger caught the light from the city below them, and Victoria realized that Elena hadn't just returned her wedding ring, she'd returned her to the possibility of a life lived in service to something larger than personal success, to the radical proposition that wealth was meaningless unless it was deployed in service of connection, completion, and the simple daily practice of helping other people's stories reach the endings they deserved. For the first time in 3 decades, Victoria Ashford felt truly wealthy. 5 years later, Victoria stood in the same Brooklyn neighborhood where she'd once been young and heartbroken, but now she was looking at something that would have been impossible to imagine during those dark months 30 years ago. The Richard and Victoria Ashford Community Center, a renovated warehouse that had become the headquarters for what Elena called the infrastructure of care. A network of programs, partnerships, and people committed to the simple proposition that everyone's story deserved to reach completion. The building buzzed with activity that represented the accumulation of hundreds of individual decisions to choose connection over isolation, service over accumulation, hope over fear. In the main hall, Carlos led a poetry workshop for teenagers whose parents worked multiple jobs and who'd found in verse a way to process experiences that mainstream culture rarely acknowledged. The basement had been converted into an art studio where Janet taught painting and sculpture to elderly residents of nearby housing projects, many of whom were creating visual art for the first time in their lives.
Is to create more opportunities for connection, for completion, for the simple daily practice of helping other people write the endings their stories deserve. Victoria looked around the room filled with voices and stories, at Elena, who had become her dearest friend, at the community that had grown from a single act of kindness 30 years ago. The documentary cameras captured the moment, but Victoria knew the real story couldn't be filmed. It lived in the countless invisible threads connecting every person who had chosen to care for someone else's dreams. Outside, the Brooklyn sun set behind buildings that housed generations of stories still being written. Victoria touched the ring on her finger, no longer a symbol of loss, but of transformation, of the radical truth that love never really ends, it just changes form, becoming kindness, community, and the possibility that we might all be caretakers for pieces of each other's stories. "What happens next?" Dr. Kim asked as the interviews concluded. Victoria smiled, watching Elena help an elderly man record his memories while children from the art program painted murals that would outlast them all. The same thing that happened 30 years ago when a waitress decided to keep a stranger's ring safe, she said. People take care of each other, one story at a time. The ring caught the last light of day, and Victoria Ashford, who had learned that the greatest wealth was measured in completed stories and human connection, knew that her own story had finally found its proper ending. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with us. Stories like this take tremendous time and effort to research and bring to you. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that prove love and kindness can triumph over any obstacle. What would you do if someone returned something precious you'd lost decades ago? Let us know in the comments below.